Welcome everyone, my name is Will Wilkinson. It's my great pleasure and honor to welcome Andrew Harvey, modern mystic, born in India. Andrew's been a Rumi scholar for 40 years. He's written 5 books on Rumi, produced numerous CDs, and has just co-produced and written a new documentary film on Rumi. Really looking forward to this discourse. To begin, Andrew, I'd love you to explain how is it that this amazing Persian poet, this mystic, Rumi, in the 13th century wrote what he wrote, and that it's resonating today to the degree that he's one of our most popular authors?
Well, first of all, Will, he didn't write it. Rumi didn't write a thing. What happened was that Rumi would go into trance, he would go into ecstasy, he'd lean against a pillar, and these perfectly formed poems in classical Persian would pour out of him. And his disciples, his heart friends, would write them down and then bring them to him when he'd come down from this elevated state, and he'd correct them.
So he never wrote himself?
Never wrote a word.
Remarkable.
Because it wasn't about him writing.
Yeah.
It was about being possessed by the beloved in heart, mind, soul, and body, so the beloved could come through him and use his amazing mind and his even more amazing heart and soul to deliver the message of the beloved to humanity, because Rumi is the voice of the beloved in time.
And why do you think it is that his, I don't want to say resurgence, because I think he's always been popular, but why has it escalated the way it has here in the 21st century? Everybody's reading Rumi.
Just before he died, he wrote a quatrain, and the quatrain goes like this. And he's talking about his relationship with his great soul brother and teacher and heart beloved Shams of Tabriz. And the quatrain is, "Those tender words we said to one another have been stored in the secret heart of heaven. And one day, like the rain, they will fall and spread, and the whole world will grow green with our love."
Exquisite.
So, at the moment of our greatest danger, at the moment when the future of humanity is threatened, at the moment when everything is on the line and everything is at stake, the voice of the beloved through Rumi is returning to us to give us the highest wisdom and the deepest and richest inspiration. The return of Rumi is one of the central mystical facts of our time. It's not a coincidence. It's part of the divine mercy that knows exactly where we are, knows exactly what we need, and knows that in the poetry of Rumi, we have the most astounding possible, the most inspiring possible guide to birthing the next stage of human evolution, the birth of the divine human.
Tell us about the difference between what I've heard you speak of as the authentic Rumi and the New Age version. You said something the other day when we were doing a radio interview, I wrote down because it was so memorable. You talked about the Jerry Garcia of the Sacred Heart kind of Rumi. And I sensed you said that not with a lot of respect.
Well, I don't want to offend any Grateful Dead fans, and I'm one myself. But
what did you mean by that compared to the authentic Rumi?
Look, our culture can turn the highest truths into tofu and can make a musical out of the Sermon of the Mount. So in our culture, there's a tendency to limit the passion, the power, and the rigor of all the great mystical traditions. We want mysticism light, preferably a mysticism that enables us to become very powerful, very sexy, very rich, and appear on Oprah all the time. That's the standard rubbish that you get peddled on the bazaar all the time. And Rumi has been, in a certain sense, betrayed, not by the great translators like Coleman, and not by the people who've written serious and wonderful work on him, but by people who simply want to see him as a love poet. Rumi's much more than a love poet.
Yeah.
Rumi is a prophet, and there's rigor and fury and tremendous focused passion in his work. Because what happened to Rumi in his life is that he went through a shattering process with his great teacher and beloved Shams, who was a killer of a being, a real butcher of God, an assassin of the light. And he incorporated into his gentler and sweeter nature this sword of light that was his teacher. And that sword is present in all of his poetry. So if you don't really get that Rumi is far more than a poet of love, he is the voice of the divine. And the divine has a voice that is, of course, tender and cherishing and nourishing, but is also at times unbelievably ruthless and ferocious in its clarity and demand. You're not really reading Rumi, you're reading your rosebud Rumi, as I call it.
So the authentic Rumi, one of the most popular authors in the 21st century, and look at what's going on in the world.
Exactly.
As you're speaking about his fierceness, I can't help but thinking of the destruction aspect of what's going on right now.
Well, this is one of the most important reasons why he is so important. Look, what Rumi is bringing us are the two things that we need to get through this appalling evolutionary crisis we are in. The first thing that we need is an overwhelmingly beautiful and holy and ecstatic and inspiring vision of universal divine love and of us being absolutely, totally loved by the divine. That's the first thing that we need, because that gives us the truth of our essential divine nature. The second thing that we need is a tremendous bitch slap from God to get real about what's really happening, which is that we're hurtling towards potential extinction, and we need the map, the real map of the process that we are in, which is nothing less than a global dark night process.
Well,
and Rumi is someone who lived through that process in the most excruciating, but also the most glorious way. So he can give us the map and give us where that map could potentially lead if only we got real, surrendered to love, allowed our false selves to die, and became possessed by the beloved, and able to enact the beloved's laws in reality through sacred action. So Rumi is giving us the whole enchilada, the real vodka.
Well, I would love you to walk us along that map in just a moment. But I'd first like to go back to the inauthentic Rumi.
Yes.
And the other day I also heard you mention, how did you put it, something about we need to get over the fantasy of our personal liberation.
Right.
And I love the feeling of that. Say more about that, the whole personal growth movement, relative to what you're talking about, relative to Rumi.
Well, let's begin with Rumi's own vision of his own poetry. Rumi had a very ambiguous relationship with his own poetry. On the one hand, he must have known that glory was pouring through him, but on the other hand, he was also aware of how people could use even the most splendid, even the most sublimely inspired poetry as a kind of drug to get high on.
Right.
And one of the things that I've talked to Coleman Barks at length about is the danger of using this intensely moving poetry as a kind of narcotic to get high on and to be able to avoid, to be able to escape the real responsibilities of our position in the world in this crisis.
Well, how would you describe those real responsibilities?
Well, I think the responsibilities are absolutely clear. There are three interlinked responsibilities. The first responsibility that every adult now has on the planet is to get real about what's really happening. And what's really happening is that we have a death machine in power, which is driving humanity and a great deal of nature to the brink of extinction. There is no more time to fool around about this. The second responsibility that each adult has is to plunge deep into sacred practice in whatever way they choose, so as to come into direct connection with the divine consciousness that lives in each of us, so as to be inspired by its peace and its passion. And the third responsibility is to get off the cushion, to get off the meditation cushion, to get out of any kind of cultic, narcotic vision of spirituality, to get out of the fantasy of private liberation, and to realize that love doesn't mean a hill of beans unless you're putting it into real action with your real resources right now. Those three responsibilities are each ones that Rumi addresses constantly throughout his poetry.
I think especially these days, a lot of people are in a funk.
Yes.
And they are confused, they feel powerless, they don't know what to do.
Yes.
Now let's imagine some of them are reading Rumi and being inspired. What's next?
Well, first, it's very important that they do read Rumi, because if anybody understands funk, paralysis, despair, it's this man. Rumi lived through the most appalling suffering, and that's one of the reasons why I love him, is because he's so frank about the cost of the real path. The real path is not for sissies, and it's certainly not for narcissists, because the real path demands a death of the false self, and Rumi went through that death. But Rumi is also a fountain of living, fiery, ecstatic, passionate inspiration. So if they read Rumi and go deep into that reading, they'll find in his work a source of radiant energy. But that's not going to be enough. To read Rumi in any way that doesn't fuel real action is to take Rumi as a form of heroin.
So reading Rumi, being inspired, is the beginning, not the end.
Exactly.
It's the stimulation to then get active in the world.
Yes, and he himself says this in one of his last poems. He says, don't read me and just get excited. Read me and die into love, and then be love acting in the world. Rumi was deeply loved by his whole world, and he wasn't loved only as a poet. Rumi was loved as a fully realized being who poured himself out in his world to heal and to act in many different ways to reflect love's reality in reality. And that's what we must do.
And Andrew, I know that you are constantly encouraging people to engage in what you call sacred activism. And I'd like to look into that now through the Rumi lens.
Yes.
So as I said, reading, being inspired, getting active in the world. Let's talk a bit about spiritual practice, daily practice.
Yes.
Which is so important to allow one to have what's necessary to go into the world.
Well, you can't begin to truly understand anything about Rumi unless you've done quite a lot of deep spiritual practice. And you cannot, and must not, I would say, go into the inferno of this crisis without being armored and inspired by deep, deep sacred practice.
Now that's a very interesting term, being armored. Usually that's considered a negative thing. So what are you saying?
Well, no, you need, as Marianne Woodman once said to me, said, going into the inferno of this crisis is like walking into a forest fire dressed in a paper tutu. Don't do it. And
what
by
an image.
Armored, I mean, you need to have the asbestos of divine peace and divine energy and divine passion so as to be able to go into the chaotic, violent, terrifying flames of this crisis and not get destroyed by them.
Well, what you're saying is quite revolutionary, really, because it's in direct opposition to the two usual habits, one of being sweet and nice and meditating and ignoring the world, not even watching the news.
Well, that is such horseshit.
Or fighting and battling. So this is something different.
What we're talking about is the lover warrior, and that's what Rumi represents, the great tradition in Sufi mysticism of the authentic lover who's also a radiant warrior for truth and for justice and for compassion. So the contemporary New Age mysticism is not real mysticism. It's a polluted capitalist version of mysticism which serves the death machine because it keeps people passive in the face of overwhelming cruelty and overwhelming injustice and overwhelming destruction.
That may be one of the good things about today, is that people are being forced to get off the sidelines.
Yes, I think the great achievement of Donald Trump will have been to really make the Americans at last begin to become awake about the ghastly shadow of America and its appalling responsibilities.
So you've mentioned often the 4 Sufi practices, and I'd like you to say a little more about those.
Well, there are many more than 4, but there are essential practices which are very important. The first practice is the practice of the Shahada, the remembrance of God. And this really is the key practice. And that is a practice in which you say the La ilaha illallah, there is no other God but God. And you say it with enormous intensity and understanding that it has three different meanings. The first meaning is the only final reality is the eternal light. Everything comes out of the eternal light and goes back into the eternal light. That is the only lasting reality. And I pledge myself, heart, mind, soul, and body to that. The second meaning is, I understand that the only goal of human life is unity with reality. And I vow that I will not make an idol of success or fame or sex or power. I will only choose as the object of my devotion the eternal beloved.
I'm not so sure we're doing very well on that one.
I don't think so.
No.
The third one, third meaning is that, and this is a very subtle meaning, when you say there is no other God but God, who is saying that? It must be the God in you saying that. So as you say it, it's the consciousness within you that is acknowledging the consciousness without that is manifesting everything.
So this is the direct connection that you speak of so often, which is what Rumi advocated, which made him so dangerous.
Well, yes, it's always dangerous when anybody steps up and says you have a direct connection with God. You can be empowered directly in the core of your life. And
you don't need the guru.
You don't need
the priests, etc.
Well, I think you might need a very evolved mentor. He did. And I think this is one of the most amazing things about his life. I don't believe that Shams was his guru. I think Shams was something very much more important than a guru. Shams was Rumi's beloved, and they had a beloved relationship, not a sexual relationship and not a hierarchical relationship. They met as blazing, impassioned human beings and fell absolutely and profoundly in love with each other, heart, mind, soul, and body, beyond time, beyond space. And through that love, they birthed each other into a whole new level of evolution.
Well, say more about the mentorship relationship. Obviously, that was infused with so much fiery love, passion. In the world we're in, and those watching who are wanting help, who need help, mentorship, say a bit about the accuracy of mentorship, the kind you're speaking of.
Well, I think the first important thing to say to anybody is be very careful about who you choose for your mentor. Do not rush into a mentor relationship out of desperation, because a lot depends on the quality of being of the mentor. So the kind of mentor that you need is somebody who is truly perhaps a little bit further on the path than you, extremely humble about their attainments, and willing to share with you their failings, their failures, and their shadows, so as to really make sure from the beginning that you don't idealize them, that you don't project onto them what you want to find, that you claim your own golden shadow, if you like, you withdraw the shadow, and so that you really can establish a naked friendship.
That last one seems to be the acid test to me.
Yes.
That the one who's providing mentorship is transparent and honest about his own learnings.
But he also must be, or she also must be, somebody who's putting it into practice, who's not passionate about being a mentor and not secretly feeding off the relationship for their own ego.
Right, or making a big career out of it.
Exactly. Plato said the only people who should rule are the people who don't want to rule. The only person you should choose as a mentor is somebody who doesn't need to be a mentor to feel strong about their lives.
Yeah, and the Native Americans said, anyone can be chief except someone who wants to be chief.
Exactly. And,
same thing.
And in India they say there are many gurus but very few disciples.
Exactly. Well, I'd like you to walk us down this path a little more, the path of transformation, renewal, rebirth. I know that this is your life's work and has been since you were so young. You were born into this. You know this path very well. Can you guide our viewers a little bit along this path? The Rumi path of...
Oh, well, it's not just Rumi's path. It's the path. What I've discovered in my own journey and from my own experience and from my plunging in different mystical traditions, because I've been initiated into Buddhism, Hinduism, shamanism, Christian mysticism and, of course, Islamic mysticism through Rumi. And what I've discovered is that there is a path towards the divinization of the human that has fundamentally 4 stages. The first stage is when you wake up for the first time to the divine energies and the divine consciousness living within you. And this is usually a time of rapture and excitement. And the danger of that is, of course, that you think you're already Jesus and Buddha rolled into one. You become massively inflated. We all do at this stage. But if you're sincere, you go through the first dark night. There are actually 2 dark nights on the path. And the first dark night is a purification of the senses. And very often in this stage, people go through a major crisis. And they learn through that they have to be much clearer, and they get into a very much deeper spiritual practice.
Now, I can imagine there's resistance to going into that.
Oh, of course. There's resistance all the way along until there's no more resistance, nobody left to be resisting. So what happens then is that there is an overwhelming experience, which is an awakening experience. And it's usually an experience of the divine light. And that prepares the second stage. And that stage is an enormously empowered stage in which the light is around you, you know the light is in you, and you're crackling and burning with enormous passion and vigor and rigor in it. And that's usually the stage where you gain tremendous powers, creative powers, clairvoyant powers sometimes, powers of charisma. And that stage has an incredible danger because the subtle ego is still alive. And if the subtle ego claims those powers, you actually fall into the depths of darkness and ignorance. And there are so many, I would say the majority of gurus are in that stage, and they are using divine powers for very human ends, and this is incredibly dangerous.
You know, as you're describing this, I'm imagining the path almost like steps.
Yes.
And you can get stuck on a particular step.
Absolutely, until you can't, and that's the end of the path. And that, what happens then is that if you're really sincere at this stage, and if you're aware of these seductions, which very few people are, this is a very high stage, the second stage.
Now, can a person navigate that on their own, or is this where
well,
the
this
mentor
is where a mentor could be useful, or a
Yeah.
friend could be useful, but God is pretty good at actually pummeling you. So what happens at that second stage is that you are, if you're sincere, you're rewarded by the dark night, in which the divine kills you personally, and in which a series of absolutely impossible situations, very painful, are created to kill your subtle ego, to kill the subtle identifications. And this is an agony. Everybody has to go through this who wants to be a true divine human, but it is the most terrifying moment of the path, and Rumi understood it because he went through it completely. Then, if the dark night is gone through with surrender and humility and through the grace of the beloved, the divine consciousness descends in a way that it cannot descend before, because you're finally burnt away enough for it to fill you. And the third stage is the stage of union, the stage in which your self is one with the divine self. That isn't the end of the path.
Well, I was going to say, that sounds pretty good. Can we stop there?
We would like to, many people would like to, but actually you can't stop there, because part of the experience of the divine self is an experience of its burning, compassionate, passionate love for justice and compassion and other people and all sentient beings. So if you're truly in union, what will arrive in that state to you is your sacred mission. And that'll be the fourth stage, which is birthing, becoming a birther in and under the divine of the new dispensation, the new world, the new life.
So this is coming into the world yourself.
Yes, as yourself.
Yes, with a
and
big S.
governed by God and surrendered to God, doing God's work. And this is a very intense stage, and it has dangers too, because you can be sidetracked and sideswiped by the remnants of your shadow. So you always will be working in surrender with the dark side of yourself.
Yeah.
But the amazing power of that stage is that you know that God is living in you as you. You know what your work is, and the divine will guide you, and will guide you directly in amazing ways to realize the mission that it's entrusted you with.